Hello. Today we're going to dive into my little archive with this. A brochure from the 30th of April 1979 and the opening of the Jubilee line. I love documents like this. They're a great insight into what people thought at the time and where they believed the tube network was going to go. I mean, of course, we have the benefit of 4.5 decades of hindsight, but they did not. So, the Jubilee line. The name actually refers to the fact that it was supposed to open in 1977 for Queen Elizabeth II's Silver Jubilee. That's also why it's quote-unquote silver on the map. During development it was a darker grey and it was going to be called the Fleet Line. I rather like this logo, which doesn't seem to be in public use anymore. I know they also came up with a special logo for the Victoria Line, which again, I don't believe is in current use. I just think they're pretty good logos. I think it would be fun if all the lines had their own logo. Anyway, this particular logo was designed by William Fenton. A significant chunk of the Jubilee line actually wasn't new at all in 1979. The line between Stanmore and Baker Street was opened in 1932 by the Metropolitan Railway. In 1937 it was transferred to the Bakerloo line, and in 1979 it simply swapped its identity over to the Jubilee. What was new was the section from Baker Street to Charing Cross, and that's what this brochure commemorates. It was a relatively short section, 2¾ miles long and consisting of only 4 stations: Baker Street, Bond Street, Green Park and Charing Cross. Of those, only Baker Street, Bond Street and Green Park are still in use. Charing Cross was abandoned in 1999, when the line was extended to Stratford and it was no longer possible to use the old alignment. There are some fascinating behind-the-scenes photos from construction here, and looking into some of the places the public don't normally get to see. What's weird is seeing them looking all shiny and new. This ventilation shaft at Green Park is still there, but it doesn't look as clean as that these days. I mean, you wouldn't expect it to, but you know. Hidden London do tours of some of these stations. If you're curious to see them for yourself, check out the London Transport Museum's website. There's some insight into how much had to be done to get this thing built, even a short line like this. Construction began in 1972, so that's nearly 7 years, hence the fact that it wasn't ready for the actual Jubilee. Adding another line to an existing station isn't just a matter of plonking the new platforms down. Consideration needs to be given to interchange, to crowd flow, and of course, how to put this stuff in around all the other stuff that's already under the streets of London. At Bond Street, for instance, the northern outfall sewer had to be diverted. At Charing Cross, the ventilation tunnels had to avoid Nelson's Column. Actually, Charing Cross required a total rebuild. These days, the tube lines serving Charing Cross are the Northern Line and the Bakerloo Line. But prior to 1979, these were considered to be 2 separate tube stations. The Northern Line station was called Strand, and the Bakerloo Line one was called Trafalgar Square. That's always seemed a bit strange to me, because technically they were both built by the same company, Underground Electric Railways of London, and they liked to integrate their stations for rapid interchange wherever possible. Anyway, they didn't. With the arrival of the Jubilee line, London Transport decided it was about time something was done about this. A new ticket hall was built, complete with a connection to a new system of subways under the Strand. Much is made in the brochure of the sound-deadening properties of the materials used, which London Transport confidently believed would give the station a relaxing feel, even in rush hour. I'll let you be the judge of that. They also hired an artist, David Gentleman, to give the platforms a makeover. The Northern Line platforms would get a mural depicting the construction of the actual cross that gives the area its name. The Bakerloo Line platforms would get murals reflecting the nearby National Portrait Gallery. And the murals on the Jubilee Line depict Nelson's Column, undoubtedly the most iconic landmark around here. There were also murals by June Fraser at Green Park, commemorating the actual park. Those at Baker Street by Robin Jakes recreate scenes from the Sherlock Holmes stories, Sherlock Holmes being probably the best-known resident of Baker Street, despite not actually being real. and those at Bond Street, one of London's most famous and prestigious shopping districts, portray a parcel. Those were designed by Tom Eckersley. Eckersley seems to have done quite well out of the Underground. He also designed the murals at King's Cross, Euston, Finsbury Park, and Heathrow Terminals 2 and 3. I guess he must have been pretty easy to work with. Now, these days, a lot of people complain about the age of the Bakerloo Line trains. They are the 1972 stock, so when this brochure was published, those trains were already in service. The brochure explains that at this time the Bakerloo Line was partially operating using what they describe as red trains. That is the 1938 stock, dating from before the Second World War. The idea, they explain, is that the Jubilee Line would begin operating using former Northern Line trains and the more modern Bakerloo Line trains, i.e. the 1972 stock. Then the Jubilee Line would get new trains of its own in the early 80s, and the former Jubilee Line trains would get cascaded back to the Bakerloo Line. Ironically, those new trains that London Underground trumpeted as revolutionising travel for the Bakerloo Line have now been in service longer than the red trains had been in 1979. As for the new trains for the Jubilee Line, those were the 1983 stock. These were not a great success, mostly because they had single doors, which meant that they took too long to load and unload. They have since been withdrawn. There's a carriage in the museum depot at Acton, or if you don't want to wait until one of their open weekends, you can see some of them at the Underground Village in Shoreditch. The current trains in use, the 1996 stock, have unusually small windows, and that's because they were designed to match the 1983 stock. The 1995 stock in use on the Northern Line uses the same basic body type, so that was also built to match an unsuccessful train that's no longer in service. The final thing that I think is very interesting is this map. The brochure talks about the Jubilee Line from Stanmore to Charing Cross as Stage 1. Stage 2 would have taken the line to Fenchurch Street, and Stage 3 through the Docklands to Beckton and Thamesmead. We get a fairly detailed description of what was planned for Stage 2. The first station would have been at Aldwych, where there was to be interchange with the Piccadilly Line. Well, Aldwych and the Piccadilly Line branch leading to it were both abandoned in 1994, although again you can still tour it sometimes. Then there would have been a station at Ludgate Circus, and I swear there were so many proposals for a Ludgate Circus station, it must have been the most popular station ever built. The next would have been Cannon Street, which would not only have connected with the main line, the District Line and the Circle Line, but would have had a connection to the Bank Monument complex. So I guess it would have been Bank Monument Cannon Street, and it would have been possible to get a train from one part of the station to another. And finally, Fenchurch Street, whose closest underground connection had hitherto been Tower Hill. Stage 3 was less concrete at this point. At this time, the redevelopment of the Docklands was kind of stalled, and the government were umming and ahhing about whether there should even be a tube line there. This was long before Canary Wharf. What's also interesting is that I happen to have a brochure from 1971 for the opening of the Brixton extension of the Victoria Line, and that shows a very different Jubilee Line proposal. Well, obviously it's still called the Fleet Line, and you can see that they hadn't figured Charing Cross Station out yet, but after Stage 2 it would run to New Cross Gate and Lewisham, so evidently things were still in flux. As it happened, despite the apparent eagerness of the authorities to get things going, the extension wouldn't come until 1999, and it would take a very different route. And so much for Charing Cross. Well, I do hope you enjoyed today's regal tale from the Tube. If you did, it would be nice if you would click that like button and perhaps subscribe for more. I would like, as always, to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your kind support. You are the Eckersley mural to my 70s station. And I will see you all again very soon. Cheerio.